The chill of the marble floor is the first thing you register. It seeps through the thin soles of your sandals, a constant, indifferent cold that travels up your legs. You are standing in the atrium of your master's villa, a space designed to project power and wealth. The air is heavy with the scent of expensive lamp oil and a faint, sweet smell of watered wine from a nearby dining chamber. Light from the open roof illuminates a basin in the center of the room, the water catching dust motes as they drift in the still air. Your legal standing is identical to the bronze statue of Mars in the corner, to the inlaid mosaic beneath your feet, to the very roof tiles that keep the rain out. You are an object of property, the tool with a voice. Your value is not in your thoughts, your memories, or your hopes. It is calculated in cestices, recorded in a ledger alongside livestock and land. You are an asset, and the concept of justice, as it applies to a person, does not apply to you. You are a thing. This was the state of being for millions within the Roman world. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings. Provided you believe these stories must be unearthed, and as we prepare our examination, share in the comments below the historical figure you believe is most fundamentally misunderstood by the modern world. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. To comprehend the legal framework that governed Roman slavery, one must first discard modern conceptions of human rights and personhood. Roman law, a system of immense complexity and sophistication, was built upon a foundational division. The world was composed of personae, persons, and res, things. This was not a philosophical suggestion but a rigid, organizing principle. Freeborn Romans, and to a lesser extent other free inhabitants of the empire, occupied the category of personae. They possessed the legal capacity to marry, to own property, to make contracts, and to seek redress in the courts. Slaves, by contrast, were legally classified as res. They were things. This was not a pejorative description, it was their precise legal definition. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, articulated this with stark clarity in his Institutes, a standard legal textbook of the era. He stated that the primary division in the law of persons is that all men are either free or slaves. From this single distinction, all other legal realities flowed. As a thing, a slave could not own property. Any assets they might acquire, through whatever means, legally belonged to their master. They could not enter into a legally binding contract for their own benefit. They could not legally marry. Their unions were considered mere cohabitation, or contubernium, a pairing that could be dissolved at the master's women, which produced offspring that, by law, belonged to the master of the mother. They had no standing in court to bring a suit on their own behalf. If a slave was injured by a third party, it was the master who would sue for damages, just as one would for damage to a cart or an ox. The basis of the legal action was not the slave's suffering, but the owner's financial loss. More specifically, slaves were categorized as res mancipi. This was a special class of property considered fundamental to the Roman agricultural household and the state's foundation. It included land in Italy, beasts of burden like oxen and horses, certain rural rights, and slaves. The transfer of such important property could not be done informally. It required a highly ritualized and public ceremony known as mancipatio, or formal conveyance, to transfer ownership of a slave. The buyer and seller had to appear before at least 5 adult male Roman citizens, acting as witnesses, plus a 6th individual, a scale minus holder. The buyer would grasp the slave, declare, "I affirm that this human is mine by the law of the Romans, and he has been bought by me with this bronze and this bronze scale," and would then strike the scale with a piece of bronze, which he handed to the seller as a symbolic price. This was the exact same ceremony used to transfer a plot of farmland. Ritualistic nature of the act reinforced in the minds of all participants the slave's status as an object, a piece of foundational property to be formally conveyed under the state's oldest and most solemn laws. This legal status as property was absolute. It did not matter if a slave was a captured warrior, a learned Greek tutor, a skilled artisan, or an individual born into slavery within the household. While their market value and daily treatment might vary enormously based on their skills, origin, and their master's disposition, their legal minus existence was uniform. They were human chattel. This legal definition is the necessary starting point for any analysis of the master-minus-slave relationship. It established a baseline where the slave was not a person with limited rights, but an object over which an owner exercised specific powers of ownership. It is from this foundation of the slave as a thing that the next legal concept, the absolute power of the master, logically and terrifyingly extends. The legal classification of a slave as a thing, a piece of property, was not merely a passive definition. It was the necessary precondition for the active and comprehensive authority wielded by an owner, a power known in Roman law as dominica potestas. This was the power of the dominus, the master, and it was among the most absolute forms of authority conceivable. It was a private jurisdiction, exercised primarily within the confines of the household, or domus, a space where the master's word was, for all practical purposes, law. Dominica potestas extended to every facet of a slave's existence, from their labor and physical body to their very life. It was a totalizing power, derived not from a contract or a social agreement, but from the rough act of ownership. The most fundamental expression of this power was the master's unlimited claim on the slave's labor. A slave's time and energy were not their own. They could be compelled to work in any capacity, at any time, for any duration the master decreed. There was no concept of a working day, of rest periods mandated by law, or of tasks deemed unsuitable. A field hand could be made to work from before sunrise until after sunset, while a domestic slave could be expected to be on call for 20-4 hours a day. This authority over labor was not just about economic output. It was a constant, tangible demonstration of the master's control. The slave's body was an instrument, and the master was the sole director of its use. This extended to the slave's skills. If a slave was a talented musician, a physician, or a scribe, these abilities belonged to the master to be used, rented out, or sold as he saw fit. Flowing directly from the ownership of the slave's body was the master's power of physical discipline, known as coercitio. The Roman legal system recognized the master's right to punish a slave for any perceived transgression, from disobedience to laziness to simple error. The methods and severity of this punishment were left almost entirely to the master's discretion. Instruments of corporal punishment were standard features of a slave-owning household. The historical and archaeological records are replete with references to the flagrum, a heavy whip often embedded with pieces of metal or bone, and the use of branding irons to mark slaves as property, especially those prone to running away. Shackles were common, not only as a preventative measure but also as a form of standing punishment. This right to inflict pain was not seen as an aberration but as a necessary to love management, essential for maintaining order and productivity among a population with no legal rights and no incentive to work beyond the avoidance of pain. The state did not interfere in a master's correction of his property. The ultimate expression of dominica potestas was the master's traditional right over the life and death of his slave, the ius vitae haec q. In the early and middle republic, this right was considered an inherent part of ownership. Just as a man could choose to break it to law slaughter an animal, so too could he legally kill his slave. By the late Republic and early Empire, the period of our focus, a certain social stigma may have attached to the casual or capricious murder of a slave. Philosophers might debate the wisdom of such an act, and neighbors might view a particularly cruel master with distaste, but the legal reality remained largely unchanged. The state's jurisdiction typically stopped of the Roman home. A master killing his own slave was an internal, domestic matter, a disposition of his own property. There was no public prosecutor to bring charges, and another Roman citizen would have no legal standing to object. It required an extraordinary set of circumstances, usually involving a threat to public order, for the state to intervene in how a master managed his human assets. This power stands in stark contrast to another form of absolute authority in Roman law, patria potestas, the power of a father over his descendants. While a father also held the power of life and death over his children in theory, this authority was framed by duties of piety, tradition, and the continuation of the family line. A son, though under his father's power, was still a Roman citizen with a distinct legal personality and the future potential to become a head of household himself. Dominica potestas had no such reciprocal obligations or social framework. It was purist ulpe and acknowledged the philosophical discomfort this created, noting that while under civil law slaves are considered as nothing, under natural law all people are equal. This statement is profoundly revealing. It shows that educated Romans understood the contradiction at the heart of their society. They knew they were upholding a legal fiction, treating beings they recognized as human in nature as objects in law. This legal fiction was maintained because it was the bedrock of their economy and social order. It was this absolute, privately held power of life and death that the lex patronia would later target, not to abolish it, but to regulate one single, very public expression of it. The absolute power of Dominica potestas was not an abstract legal theory, it was the essential mechanism that converted human beings into fungible economic assets. The entire Roman economic system, from the agricultural estates that fed its cities to the luxurious households of its elite, was built upon the foundation of chattel slavery. This was not a peripheral feature of their economy, it was the central engine. Understanding a slave's journey from a free person to a line item in a ledger requires an examination of the vast, efficient, and brutal supply chain that fed the Roman world's insatiable demand for forced labor. The primary source of new slaves for the Republic and early empire was military conquest. Roman military campaigns were exercises in both territorial expansion and mass human acquisition. Generals like Julius Caesar, in his accounts of the Gallic Wars, recorded the capture and sale of hundreds of thousands of people. Following a successful siege or battle, entire populations could be enslaved. These captives were typically sold on minor sight by quaestores accompanying the army, with the profits flowing into the military treasury or the general's personal coffers. Slave traders, known as mangwans, followed the legions, ready to purchase large numbers of people at wholesale prices, march them back toward the heart of the empire, and sell them at a substantial markup. This direct link between military success and the slave supply meant that the expansion of the empire was synonymous with the expansion of slavery. Beyond conquest, piracy and brigandage were also significant sources, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean before the campaigns of Pompey the Great brought a measure of control to the seas. Pirates would raid coastal towns and capture ships, selling their human cargo in remote markets. Internally, the empire generated its own supply. Condemned criminals could be sentenced to slavery in the mines, a fate often considered worse than death. Abandoned children could be legally raised as slaves by those who found them. However, the most stable and significant source of slaves, particularly during periods of relative peace like the Pax Romana, was natural increase. Children born to a slave mother, known as verna e, legally inherited their mother's status and belonged to her owner, regardless of the father's identity. This created a self-minus perpetuating system where slave minors owning households under states could breed their own labor force. Once acquired, a slave entered a sophisticated market. Major cities like Rome, Capua, and Ephesus had large, established slave markets, where human beings were displayed and sold like any other commodity. Slaves intended for sale were often paraded through the streets, their place of origin and any special skills advertised by the traders. At the market itself, they were placed on raised platforms to be inspected by potential buyers. By law, a placard, or titulus, was hung around the slave's neck, detailing their nationality, skills, and any known defects, say tendency to run away, a chronic illness like epilepsy, or a propensity for theft. The state's interest enforced by the aediles who supervised the markets was not in the slave's welfare, but in transactional transparency to prevent fraud. A buyer who discovered an undisclosed defect within a certain period could nullify the sale. This legal framework of warranties and disclosures is identical to that used for the sale of livestock, reinforcing the slave's status as an object of commerce. The price of a slave varied enormously based on a cold calculus of utility and desirability. An unskilled male laborer in his physical prime, destined for a farm or a mine, might represent a baseline value. A female slave of child-bearing age had the added value of being able to produce more slaves for the owner. The highest prices were commanded by those with specialized skills: literate scribes, accountants, physicians, skilled cooks, musicians, and attractive, educated household servants from Greece or the East could be worth many times the price of a field hand. Their value was in the specialized service or status they provided. The Roman elite displayed their wealth and sophistication to the size and quality of their domestic staff, the familia urbana. A household might have dozens of slaves, each with a specific role: doorkeepers, litter bearers, hairdressers, valets, and pedagogues to tutor the children. This economic exploitation was not confined to domestic service. Slaves were the primary labor force in the large agricultural estates, the latifundiae, that produced grain, wine, and olive oil for the empire. They worked in chain gangs under the supervision of an overseer, who was often a slave himself. In the mines and quarries, conditions were notoriously brutal, and the life expectancy of a slave sent there was exceptionally short. Slaves were also used in commercial enterprises, with some acting as agents, managers, or craftsmen in businesses owned by their masters. An owner could also generate revenue by renting out his skilled slaves to others. In every scenario, the slave was an investment, an asset to be exploited for maximum economic return until their capacity for labor was exhausted. This treatment of human beings as pure economic instruments, to be bought, sold, and worked until broken, established the baseline of daily existence upon which even more extreme forms of exploitation could be built. The transformation of a human being into an economic asset found its most extreme expression, not in the empire's amphitheaters. The Roman arena was more than a venue for sport. It was a public stage for the ritualized display of power, justice, and death. Here, the private authority of the master over the slave's body could be magnified into a public spectacle, serving as both mass entertainment and a brutal instrument of social control. Before specific legal prohibitions were enacted, the use of slaves in these blood-soaked performances was a common and accepted feature of Roman life, representing the final and most absolute form of their objectification. Slaves were not merely participants in the games, they were often the raw material from which the spectacle was constructed. One of the most characteristic forms of arena execution was condemnation to the beasts, or damnatio ad bestias. This method was typically reserved for the lowest classes of criminals, enemy prisoners of war, and, significantly, slaves. The condemned, referred to as noexii, were sent into the arena with little or no means of self-defense to be killed by starved and provoked wild animals. Lions, bears, and wild boars would be released to hunt and dispatch the victims before a cheering crowd. This was not a swift or dignified death. It was a carefully staged theatrical event designed to maximize suspense and horror. The horror itself was the point, for the tens of thousands of slaves who might be in attendance or hear accounts of the games. The message was unambiguous. This was the potential fate of the disobedient and the rebellious. Beyond direct condemnation to beasts, slaves were also used as props in elaborate and lethal mythological reenactments. These fatal charades were a uniquely Roman fusion of high culture and low cruelty. The organizers of the games or editors would select a myth from Greek or Roman lore that ended in a violent death, and then stage it with condemned slaves in the leading roles. A slave might be dressed as Orpheus and sent into the arena with a lyre, only to be torn apart by bears instead of being charmed by his music. Another might be costumed as Icarus, raised to a great height by stage machinery, and then dropped to his death to enact the fall. The burning of Hercules on his funeral pyre could be staged with a slave chained to a stake and set alight. From the perspective of the audience, this provided a veneer of literary sophistication to the bloodshed. For the slave, it was simply a creative and terrifying method of execution. The state and its magistrates were the primary agents consigning people to these fates, as a formal mode of capital punishment. However, the line between state-sanctioned execution and a master's private disposal of his property was permeable. A master who deemed a slave incorrigibly defiant or simply wished to be rid of him could bring the slave before a local magistrate on a charge, real or invented. Given the slave's inability to testify in his own defense, securing a conviction that resulted in condemnation to the arena was often a formality. This provided a legal mechanism for a master to transform a private problem into a public spectacle, often with the state's implicit blessing. Furthermore, masters could voluntarily contribute their slaves to the games. An ambitious politician, or a wealthy citizen seeking public favor might stage his own games, or munera, as a gift to the people. To populate these games, he would need a steady supply of bodies. While some of these would be professionally trained gladiators, others could be slaves from his own household, designated for the arena as punishment, or simply to fill out the day's program. A master could force a slave to fight as a gladiator with minimal training, a near-minus certain death sentence. He could also donate a slave to be one of the victims in the beast hunts. This was seen as a legitimate, if extreme, exercise of his property rights. He was disposing of his chattel as he saw fit, with the added benefit of gaining popularity from the crowd. This was the environment before 61 AD, a system where a master's power of life and death over his slave could be seamlessly integrated into the state's most popular form of mass entertainment. It was a practice so embedded in the fabric of society that it required a specific and shocking event to even begin the process of its regulation. The Roman system of chattel slavery, while an immense engine of economic productivity, contained within it a fundamental and inescapable paradox. The Roman elite was entirely dependent on a vast population that it simultaneously unsystematically brutalized. This created a permanent, low-frequency state of anxiety and fear that permeated the slave-owning class. The master in his villa, surrounded by the human property that attended to his every need, was also surrounded by potential enemy. This was not an abstract or irrational fear. It was a psychological state grounded in the memory of violent, large-scale insurrections that had shaken the Republic to its core. The specter of rebellion was the ghost that haunted the Roman domus, and the state's response to this threat was the codification of terror as a method of control. The most significant historical traumas that shaped this mindset were the Civil Wars. Long before the rise of the empire, the Republic had been convulsed by massive slave uprisings, particularly on the vast agricultural estates, or latifundiae of Sicily. In the 2nd century BC, two separate wars erupted, led by figures like Eunus and Salvius, which saw organized armies of tens of thousands of slaves challenge and, for a time, defeat Roman consular armies. These were not mere riots. They were organized military campaigns that required a massive and sustained response from the state. They demonstrated that, under the right conditions, the enslaved population could transform from a passive labor force into a potent existential threat. The most famous and terrifying of these rebellions was, of course, the one led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus between 73 and 71 BC. What began with a small group of gladiators breaking out of their training school into a mobile army that may have numbered over 100,000 men, women, and children. For 2 years, Spartacus and his followers ranged across the Italian peninsula, defeating multiple Roman legions sent against them. From the perspective of the Roman Senate and aristocracy, this was the ultimate nightmare realized. The instruments of their own economy and entertainment had turned against them, threatening the very heartland of their power. The eventual defeat of Spartacus by the legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus was not followed by mercy or reintegration. The response was a calculated act of psychological warfare. 6,000 captured survivors of Spartacus' army were crucified. Their crosses lined the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, for a distance of over 120 miles. The bodies were intentionally left to rot for months, a grotesque and undeniable message to every slave, traveler, and citizen of the consequences of rebellion. While large-scale wars were rare, the fear they instilled was perpetual and was nourished by more common, low-level forms of resistance. Slaves engaged in work slowdowns, feigned illness, destroyed tools, and committed acts of arson. A more intimate and terrifying threat was poison, a method of resistance that required only access to the master's food and drink. These individual acts of defiance, while not threatening to the state, reinforced the idea of the enemy within. The Roman writer Seneca the Younger perfectly captured this elite paranoia, noting the common saying, "For every one slave, we have one enemy." When a master looked at his household staff, the cook, the valet, the nursemaid to his children, he could never be entirely certain of their loyalty. He was outnumbered in his own home. This pervasive fear was enshrined in Roman law through the principle of collective punishment. An ancient unseal decree stipulated that if a master was murdered in his home by a slave, and the perpetrator was not immediately identified, all slaves living under that same roof, sub iudem tectu, were to be executed. This included everyone from the field hands to the elderly domestic servants, men, women, and children. The logic was not about justice in the modern sense. It was about creating a system of compulsory self-minus policing. The law transformed every slave in a household into a potential informant and a personal bodyguard for the master. Their own survival was now directly contingent upon the master's safety. Failure to prevent an attack, even through ignorance, was a capital crime for the entire collective. It was a law born of absolute fear, designed to traumatize the enslaved community and make conspiracy impossible. It was this specific, terrifying legal principle that would soon be put to the test in a real and infamous case in the year 61 AD, creating the political and social crisis from which the Lex Petronia would emerge. The legal principle of collective punishment, designed to turn every slave household into a self-minus policing garrison, was not a dormant threat. It was an active deterrent, a mechanism of social control whose full and terrible power was rarely unleashed. In the year 61 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, this abstract doctrine of fear was thrust into the public consciousness by a single, high-profile act of violence. The event would test the resolve of the Senate, provoke a public crisis, and lay the political groundwork for a new kind of state intervention into the master-slave relationship. The case was the murder of the city prefect, Lucius P. Idonius Secundus. P. Idonius Secundus was not an ordinary citizen. As prefect does be, he was one of the most powerful officials in Rome, responsible for maintaining law and order in the capital itself. He was, in effect, the city's chief of police and its ranking magistrate in the emperor's absence. His murder, therefore, was not merely a domestic crime, it was an assault on the authority of the state. He was killed within the walls of his own mansion by one of his own slaves. The historian Tacitus, our principal source for the event, reports two possible motives circulated at the time. One was that the slave had contracted to purchase his own freedom and P. Idonius had accepted the payment but refused to manumit him. The other was that both master and slave were rivals for the affection of a male slave, and the killer could not tolerate the prefect as a competitor. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was the same. The city prefect was dead, and the perpetrator was one of his own. The identity of the killer was not in doubt. He was swiftly identified and apprehended. Under normal circumstances, he would have been summarily tried and executed, likely in some spectacular fashion as a warning to others. However, the situation was governed by a far older and more sweeping legal precedent. An ancient senatorial decree, reinforced over the centuries, stipulated that if a master was killed by a slave, all slaves who were under the same roof at the time of the murder were to be executed alongside the guilty party. The household of a man as wealthy and powerful as P. Idonius Secundus was enormous. It comprised some 400 individuals, men, women, and children. They were cooks, cleaners, scribes, bodyguards, and attendants of every kind. According to the ancestral law, all 400 were now condemned to die. The sheer scale of this impending mass execution provoked an immediate and powerful public backlash. The people of Rome, accustomed as they were to the casual brutality of their society, saw this as an act of profound injustice. A crowd gathered, demanding the release of the innocent, particularly the women and children who could have had no knowledge of or participation in the crime. The popular protest grew so large and vocal that it verged on a riot, threatening to obstruct the execution. The matter was forced into the Senate for debate, a debate that Tacitus records in detail, exposing the deep ideological fissures within the Roman elite. One faction argued for leniency. They insisted that the ancient custom was excessively cruel and should not be applied so rigidly. They made the case that many of the condemned were entirely blameless, their only crime being their presence in the same house. To execute them would be to commit mass murder under the color of law. This position, however, was met with a fierce and ultimately successful counter-argument from the traditionalists. articulated most forcefully by the respected jurist Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius' speech, as related by Tacitus, is a masterclass in the logic of elite Roman fear. He did not argue from a position of justice but from one of absolute necessity. He conceded that the law would condemn some who were innocent, but he insisted this was an unavoidable price for security. He reminded the Senate that their ancestors had distrusted the temperament of slaves, even those born and raised within their own homes. He argued that the slave population was now vast, for a multitude, a nation within a nation with its own customs and beliefs, held in check only by terror. If the law was not enforced to its fullest extent, he warned, no master would be safe, who would be protected by the number of his slaves if 400 had not protected Paedonius Secundus. The only effective deterrent, he concluded, was a law so terrifying that it forced every slave to protect his master as he would his own life. The Senate was persuaded by this argument of security over justice. The decree was upheld. The 400 slaves were to be executed. So great was the public anger that Nero was forced to call out the army. Soldiers lined the entire route to the place of execution, holding back the protesting crowds with a cordon of spears. The sentence was carried out. 400 people were put to death for a crime committed by one. This event, while a brutal affirmation of a master's security, sent a shockwave through Roman society. It demonstrated that the private, domestic exercise of power could spill into the public sphere with destabilizing consequences. The state had been forced to use its military to enforce a domestic disciplinary action, a deeply unsettling precedent. This crisis created a new political imperative. The state needed to gain more control over the most public and provocative expressions of a master's power, not for the slave's sake, but for the sake of public order. The public execution of 400 of Paedonius Secundus' slaves was a brutal reaffirmation of ancestral law, but the crisis it provoked did not simply vanish. The sight of the state deploying its legions to enforce a domestic disciplinary matter against the will of a significant portion of the Roman populace created a new political calculus. The event exposed a dangerous fissure where the private power of a master could destabilize the public order. It was in this precise political climate, in the immediate aftermath of this crisis in 61 AD, that a new and specific piece of legislation was passed, the Lex Patronia. At first glance, this law appears to be a step towards humanitarian reform. A forensic analysis of its narrow and carefully chosen language, however, reveals a very different purpose. The core provision of the Lex Patronia was remarkably specific. It prohibited a master from handing over a slave to be fought and killed by wild beasts at best as on his own authority alone. The statute was not a blanket ban on this particularly gruesome form of execution for slaves. Instead, it introduced a procedural step. If a master wished to condemn his slave to this fate, he now had to present the slave and his case before a magistrate. The law required the master to provide a causa, a just cause, for such a sentence. Only with the magistrate's official approval could the slave be sent to the arena to be devoured by animals. Let us dissect this provision with the precision it demands. The law targeted one single method of killing. It did not prohibit a master from crucifying a slave, a common punishment for rebellious slaves that was both agonizing and public. It did not prevent a master from starving a slave, working a slave to death in a mine, or applying any other form of lethal discipline within the confines of his own property. Daily brutalities that characterized the institution of slavery. Its focus was exclusively on the act of giving a slave to the beasts for public entertainment. This extreme specificity is the first and most crucial clue to its true intent. Furthermore, the law did not grant the slave any new legal standing or rights. The slave could not appeal to the magistrate on his own behalf. He could not present evidence or testify in his own defense. The legal proceeding, such as it was, remained a transaction between two parties who were considered legal persons, the master and the magistrate. The slave was still the object of the proceedings, not a participant in them. The magistrate's role was not to determine the slave's guilt or innocence in a modern sense, but to validate the master's cause of his property in this particular manner. Given the legal non-minus personhood of the slave and the immense social and political power wielded by the slave minus owning class, one can infer that securing such approval from a magistrate of the same class would often have been a procedural formality, provided the master presented a plausible case of disobedience or criminality. What made the Lex Patronia a genuine legal innovation, however, was not the protection it offered the slave, which was minimal to non-minus existent. Its true novelty was that it represented one of the first significant statutory infringements upon the traditional, near-minus absolute authority of dominica potestas. For centuries, the master's home, the domus, was considered a sacred and inviolable sphere of his own jurisdiction. The state did not, as a rule, interfere with how a master managed his property. For the first time in a meaningful way, breached that ideological wall. It took one specific power, the power to make one's slave a part of a public blood sport, and removed it from the master's sole prerogative. It did not abolish the power, it transferred the final authority for its use from a private citizen to an agent of the state. The statute, therefore, was not a piece of humanitarian legislation. It was a piece of regulatory legislation. It did not challenge the master's right to kill his slave. It did not question the slave's status as property. It simply asserted the state's interest in, and ultimate control over, a particular type of public spectacle. The law did not ask, is it wrong to kill a slave in this manner? It asked, who has the authority to sanction this public act? The Roman state was not embracing a new ethic of compassion. It was taking its first steps toward monopolizing the most spectacular and politically potent forms of public violence. The law's primary function was not to shield the slave, but to channel authority, moving a critical decision from the private household to the public courthouse. The central mechanism of the Lex Patronia was not its procedural requirement, the intercession of a magistrate. The phrase sine causa a iusoque magistratus, without cause and an order from a magistrate, is the legal engine of the entire statute. This clause fundamentally altered the dynamic of power, not between master and slave, but between the private master and the public state. By requiring official sanction for one specific form of execution, the law transformed the magistrate from a distant arbiter of public disputes into a necessary partner in what had previously been a purely domestic decision. This repositioned the state as the ultimate arbiter, the gatekeeper standing between the master's private will and the public spectacle of the arena. To understand the significance of this shift, one must first understand the role of the Roman magistrate. A magistrate was not a neutral judge in the modern sense. He was a political appointee, a member of the elite, property minus owning class, serving as an executive agent of the state. His primary function was to uphold the law and maintain public order, the pax deorum, peace of the gods, and the stability of the city. When a master appeared before him to present a causa for condemning a slave to the beasts, the magistrate was not presiding over a trial of the slave. He was conducting an administrative review of the master's request. His concern was not with abstract justice for the enslaved, but with the interests of the state. This procedural requirement served a critical function in establishing social stability after the Pied Onius Secundus affair. That crisis had demonstrated how the unchecked private power of the dominus could generate public outrage and threaten civil unrest. By inserting a magistrate into the process, the state created a crucial buffer. The decision to send a slave to the arena was no longer the potentially capricious act of a single individual. It was now a sanctioned act of Roman justice. The magistrate's approval laundered a private desire for punishment into a public verdict. It lent the weight and legitimacy of the state to the execution, transforming it from a potential source of public anger into a formal expression of judicial authority. This provided a powerful tool for managing public perception and preventing a repeat of the riots, but had necessitated military intervention. More fundamentally, this transfer of authority was an act of sovereignty. The arena, and particularly the spectacle of Damnatio ad bestias, was the ultimate theatre of state power. It was here that the state demonstrated its ability to impose its will in the most final and terrifying manner. Allowing private citizens to contribute victims to this spectacle at their own discretion diluted the message. It equated the power of a wealthy householder with the power of the emperor and the Roman people. The Lex Patronia corrected this ideological imbalance. It asserted that the arena was the state stage, and only the state's designated agents could decide who appeared upon it. The master could propose a candidate for this brutal performance, but the magistrate representing the state retained the final right of casting. In essence, the state was not usurping the right to kill, but the right to kill in a particular way that engaged the public interest. The magistrate, in reviewing the master's causa, was ensuring that the reasons for the execution were, at least formally plausible and aligned with the state's interest in projecting an image of ordered, rational justice, however brutal. A master presenting a slave accused of attempted murder, arson, or rebellion would likely find his request quickly granted. The state had a vested interest in the public and exemplary punishment of such acts. A master seeking to condemn a slave for a minor personal slight might find his request denied, not out of concern for the slave, but because such a frivolous use of a state-sanctioned spectacle would undermine its gravitas and authority. This was a subtle but profound recalibration of power. The state claimed ownership not of the slave's life, but of the narrative surrounding his spectacular death. It ensured that from this point forward, every death in the arena at the hands of beasts would be, officially, an act of the Roman state, reinforcing its monopoly on this ultimate form of public violence. The requirement of a magistrate's approval was therefore not a check on brutality, but a claim of ownership or the production of a specific kind of public theater. The Roman state, particularly under the emperors, understood with profound acuity that power was not just exercised through legions and laws, but also through spectacle. The amphitheater was the ultimate instrument of this policy, a venue where the state could project its authority, its wealth, and its worldview onto the collective consciousness of the populace. By regulating who could supply the victims for its most dramatic scenes, the state was not protecting property, it was protecting its monopoly on the narrative of power. The lex patronia was, in effect, a law of ideological copyright. The public games, the ludi, were the central civic ritual of the Roman Empire. They were far more than simple entertainment. They were a carefully stratified representation of the social order, with seating in the amphitheater strictly segregated by class, from the senators and equestrians in the best seats to the poor, women, and slaves in the upper tiers. They were a mechanism for the emperor to display his generosity, providing the famous bread and circuses that kept the urban population quiescent. Most importantly, the events within the arena, the gladiatorial combats, the wild beast hunts, and the public executions were a living tableau of Roman dominance. Gladiators, often slaves or prisoners of war, displayed the Roman virtues of martial skill and courage in the face of death. The beast hunts, or venationes, showcased the vast reach of the empire, bringing exotic and dangerous animals from the furthest corners of the known world to be slaughtered, symbolizing Rome's subjugation of nature itself. Within this schedule of events, the midday executions of criminals, the meridini, served a crucial political and psychological purpose. These were not hidden affairs. They were the centerpiece of the day's proceedings, a raw and unfiltered demonstration of the state's power over life and death. And of all the methods of execution, damnatio ad bestias was the most symbolically potent. It was a ritual of annihilation. The victim, condemned by a Roman magistrate, was stripped of all legal and social protection, becoming a non-minus person. They were then physically erased by forces of untamed nature, which were themselves captured and controlled by the Roman state. The message to the thousands of spectators was unambiguous. This is the fate of those who defy Roman order. They will be consumed by the very chaos Rome holds at bay. For this powerful piece of political theater to be effective, its message had to be pure. The victims had to be seen as legitimate enemies of the state, traitors, rebels, murderers, practitioners of forbidden magic, or defiant slaves whose actions threatened the social order. If any wealthy citizen could, on a whim, send a domestic slave into the arena for a personal transgression like breaking a vase or being insolent, the spectacle would be corrupted. The execution would cease to be a demonstration of Roman justice and would become merely an extravagant and public display of private pique. It would reduce a solemn state ritual to the level of a domestic flogging, albeit on a grander scale. This would dilute the state's message and blur the line between the majestic, impersonal power of the emperor and the petty tyranny of a private householder. The lex patronia was the legal instrument that prevented this ideological contamination. It ensured that every human being who died in the arena at the jaws of a bear did so under the official seal of the Roman state. The master's private causa had to be validated and adopted by the magistrate, thereby transforming a domestic complaint into a public crime. The law forced the master's personal authority to be subsumed into the state's broader authority. The state maintained its exclusive right to stage this ultimate performance of dominance. It reserved for itself the sole privilege of defining who was worthy of such a spectacular and symbolic death. By monopolizing this one, highly visible method of killing, the Roman state implicitly confirmed that all the other, less theatrical methods remained well within the private master's domain, a reality to which the law was entirely indifferent. For the vast majority of the Roman Empire's enslaved population, the passage of the Lex Petronia would have been a non-minus event. It was a piece of legislation debated in the rarefied air of the Senate and recorded on tablets by legal clerks, but its effects did not ripple down to the agricultural estates of Sicily or the sprawling urban households of Rome. A slave toiling in a field or serving a meal would not have felt a sudden lightening of his burden or a new sense of security. The legal change was a distant abstraction. The immediate, tangible reality of his existence, the texture of his daily life, defined by labor subjugation, and the ever-present threat of violence remained entirely, brutally unchanged. The law had regulated a single, spectacular form of death, but it left the conditions of life completely untouched. The fundamental currency of a slave's life was labor, and the master's authority over that labor was absolute and unaffected by the new statute. The workday on a latifundii continued to be governed by the sum and the overseer's whip, not by legal statute. Slaves were roused before dawn and worked until after dusk, performing grueling manual labor with minimal rest. In the domestic sphere, the demands were different but no less total. A household slave's time was never his own, subject to the whims of every free member of the family. The Lex Petronia offered no opinion on death by exhaustion. A master who worked his property to the point of collapse and death was not in violation of any law. He was merely managing his assets inefficiently. The slave's body was a resource to be expended, and the rate of that expenditure remained the sole decision of the owner. Similarly, the master's control over the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter was a primary and unaltered instrument of power. The standard slave ration, the siberia, was not a right but a provision, calculated to provide the minimum energy required for the expected work output. A master could, and often did, use food as a tool of discipline. Reducing a slave's rations was a common punishment for laziness or minor infractions. The quality of shelter was also entirely at the owner's discretion. While valued domestic slaves might live in reasonable comfort, field hands or industrial slaves were often housed in crowded, unsanitary barracks known as agastula, sometimes kept in chains even at night. These conditions, which fostered disease and malnutrition, were a form of slow, systemic violence. Death resulting from such calculated neglect was not a crime. It was the consequence of a master's domestic arrangement, an area into which the state had no desire or authority to intrude. The most critical area left untouched by the Lex Petronia was the master's broad power of physical discipline, or coercitio. While the theatrical spectacle of damnatio, at best eyes now required a magistrate's signature, the entire universe of routine. Private violence remained the master's prerogative. The flogging of a slave for a mistake, the branding of a runaway, the use of shackles and collars, these were not considered crimes but necessary tools of household management. The Roman home was a sphere of private jurisdiction. What occurred within its walls was the master's concern. As long as a master's actions did not disrupt the public peace, the state was indifferent. A master could beat a slave to within an inch of his life, and if the slave subsequently died from those injuries, it was a private financial loss, not a public crime. The law had drawn a line around the amphitheater, but the violence that existed on the other side of that line, in the courtyards, kitchens, and fields, continued unabated. Therefore, for the individual slave, the psychological environment of constant fear and total dependency remained absolute. His survival still hinged, not on the rule of law, but on the temperament of his owner. The Lex Petronia may have removed one specific method from the master's toolbox of terror, but the toolbox itself remained full. The master could still threaten a slave with being sold away from his family, with being sent to the near certain death of the mind, or with a painful and ignominious death by crucifixion. These were powerful legal and readily available threats. The new law simply meant that if a master wished to make his slave's death a part of the public games, he had to file the appropriate paperwork. For the slave, this was a distinction without a difference. The master's power to destroy him had not been diminished, only slightly redirected. While the Lex Patronia focused its narrow legal lens on the amphitheater, it cast no shadow over the armory of pain that was a standard feature of the Roman domestic and agricultural landscape. The law was concerned with the jurisdiction of spectacular death, not the regulation of routine suffering. A master's right to inflict non-lethal, or even lethally intended, corporal punishment through a variety of recognized instruments was an unquestioned aspect of dominica potestas. These tools were not hidden artifacts of a sadistic fringe. They were the common, legally sanctioned hardware of slave management, as integral to the running of an estate as a plough or a millstone. The most common and emblematic instrument of discipline was the whip. Roman literature and law recognized several types, each with its own implicit level of severity. For minor household infractions, a simple leather strap or switch might be used. For more serious offenses, the instrument of choice was the flagrum or flagellum. This was a far more formidable weapon. It was a short, heavy whip, typically made of multiple leather thongs, which were often weighted with pieces of lead iron, or sharpened bone, or sharpened bone, or sharpened bone. A flogging with the flagrum was not a simple caning. It was a brutal act designed to inflict maximum pain and tissue damage. It could strip flesh from the bone, and repeated application could easily be fatal. The decision to use the flagrum, and the number of lashes to be administered, was entirely at the discretion of the master or his designated overseer. Its use was so commonplace that the figure of the L or Arius, the slave whose specific job was to flog other slaves, was a stock character in Roman comedies. Another common method for control and punishment was branding. A brand or stigma was a mark burned into the skin, usually on the forehead where it could not be easily concealed. This served multiple purposes. It was a permanent and public declaration of the individual's enslaved status. Runaway slaves, upon recapture, were almost invariably branded, often with letters indicating their crime, such as effigy for fugitivius. Some masters branded all their slaves as a matter of course. A permanent marking of ownership might that applied to cattle. Beyond its practical use as a deterrent to escape, branding was a profound act of psychological humiliation. It was a physical inscription of the slave's non-personhood onto their own body, a visible sign that they were an object, a piece of property. For restraint and long-term punishment, various forms of shackles and collars were employed. Field slaves on large estates were often forced to work in chain gangs, their ankles shackled together to prevent flight. At night, they might be confined in subterranean barracks, ergastula, still in chains. An individual slave deemed troublesome could be forced to wear heavy shackles as a constant impediment and a badge of their disgrace. Another particularly cruel device was the metal collar, riveted around the neck and impossible for the wearer to remove. Surviving examples of these collars often have tags attached, like the famous one from Rome which reads, "I have run away. Seize me. When you have brought me back to my masters on us, you will receive a reward." This turned any free person who encountered the slave into a potential agent of the master. The collar transformed the slave's own body into a walking notice for their own capture. These instruments, the whip, the brand, the shackle, the collar, were not illegal. They were the accepted and necessary tools for compelling labor and enforcing obedience from a population that was legally defined as property. The state did not merely tolerate their use, it implicitly sanctioned it as a vital component of the master's authority. The law only became involved when the use of these tools spilled over into public disorder, or when one citizen's use of them damaged another citizen's property. The suffering of the slave was not a legally relevant consideration. The Lex Patronia had done nothing to remove these items from the overseer's hand. It had only stipulated that if the final act of punishment was to be a public spectacle involving wild animals, a magistrate's permission slip was required. For the slave facing the flagrum in a secluded courtyard, this legal nicety was a universe away. The master's ownership of the slave's physical form was not limited to the extraction of labor or the infliction of disciplinary pain. The legal principle of dominica potestas, which granted the owner near minus absolute control over his property, extended into the most intimate spheres of a slave's existence. It encompassed an owner's unrestricted sexual access to the body of his slave. Within the cold logic of the Roman legal system, the concept of a master sexually assaulting his own slave was a legal and logical impossibility. The act we would define as rape was, in this specific context, not recognized as a crime because the victim, being property, had no legal right to consent or refuse. Roman law did have statutes against sexual offenses, most notably the lex Julia de adulti, i is coerced ins, and the general concept of street uprom, which covered various forms of illicit sexual contact. However, these laws were designed to protect the integrity of the Roman family and the property rights of male citizens. Street uprom against a freeborn, unmarried woman was a crime against her father, the paterfamilias, as it damaged her value on the marriage market and stained the family's honor. Adultery with a married woman was a crime against her husband, a violation of his exclusive sexual rights to his wife. When the victim was another man's slave, a charge could potentially be brought for injuria, an insult or outrage, or damage to property, but the legal complaint belonged to the slave's owner, not the slave's owner. Not the slave. The harm was to the master's honor or asset, not the slave body. This legal framework created a vacuum where the owner's own slaves were concerned. Since a slave was the master's own property, he could not, by definition, damage his own property in a way that the law would recognize as a crime. He could not violate his own property rights. The slave's body was considered one of the resources available to the master, and how he chose to use that resource for labor, for punishment, or for sexual gratification was a private, domestic matter, regardless of the slave's age, gender, or marital status. Male and female slaves, adults and children, were equally vulnerable. The will of the slave was not a factor in the legal equation. This reality was an accepted, if sometimes unstated, feature of Roman society. Literature from the period, from the satires of Juvenal to the comedies of Plautus, is replete with casual references to the sexual availability of slaves, the vulnerability of attractive domestic slaves, both male and female. Pure delicatus or ancilla was a common trope. These were not depicted as acts of criminal violence, but as expressions of the master's power and, at times, his lack of self-control. A philosopher like Seneca might criticize a master for excessive lust or for being a slave to his own passions, but this critique was directed at the master's character and his failure to live up to the Stoic ideal of moderation. It was not an argument for the slave's right to bodily autonomy. The slave's experience was simply not the subject of the moral calculus. The slave's own relationships offered no protection. The union between two slaves, the contubernium, was a social reality but a legal fiction. It was recognized as a pairing, and masters might even encourage such unions as they promoted stability and resulted in the birth of new slaves, vernae. However, this bond had no legal force. A master could sexually exploit a slave in a contubernium with impunity, just as he could dissolve the union at any moment by selling one of the partners. The children produced by such a union, the vernae, were particularly vulnerable, having been born into this system of absolute power and potentially subject to the master's sexual attentions from a young age. Furthermore, this right of sexual access could be commercialized. A master could profit directly by compelling his slaves to work as prostitutes. The earnings from this activity belonged entirely to the master. This practice ranged from individual masters renting out a specific domestic slave to large scale operations where a master owned and operated a brothel, or lupa NAR, staffed entirely by his own slaves. In this context, the slave was an income generating asset, and their body was the instrument of that income. The lex patronia and other similar state interventions were profoundly silent on these matters. The sexual exploitation of a slave by an owner was the quintessential domestic affair, occurring within the private sphere of the domus. It did not create public disorder, it did not challenge the state's authority, and it did not infringe upon the rights of any other citizen. It was, therefore, an area where the law was entirely absent, a space of absolute power where the slave's status as a thing was made brutally and intimately manifest. The master's power over a slave's life was not solely expressed through acts of direct, violent commission. Roman law was equally indifferent to acts of lethal omission. A master could legally bring about the death of a slave through a slow and deliberate process of calculated neglect, a method that left no visible wounds but was just as final as the whip or the sword. This form of passive execution was an inherent and unregulated feature of dominica potestas. It was the logical endpoint of viewing a slave as a disposable asset, an object whose maintenance could be withdrawn at the owner's discretion, even to the point of death. The most fundamental to love this passive minus aggressive power was the control of sustenance. The provision of food and water to a slave was not a legal duty incumbent upon a master. It was a practical necessity to keep a piece of property functional. If a master deemed a slave to be no longer useful due to age, illness, injury, or insubordination, he was under no legal obligation to continue providing for that slave's survival. He could simply cease to provide food, private method of disposal that required no weapon and created no public disturbance. An owner could lock an unwanted slave in a room and simply wait. This was not considered murder in the eyes of the law. It was, at worst, a case of letting a piece of property fall into disrepair. The same principle applied to medical care. A master who owned a valuable slave, such as a skilled artisan or an educated tutor, might invest in medical treatment if that slave fell ill, just as he would pay to have a valuable piece of equipment repaired. This was a purely economic decision. For a common laborer or an elderly domestic slave whose productive years were over, the calculation was different. A master was not legally required to summon a physician or provide medicine. He could allow an illness or an injury to run its course, even if it was treatable. The death of a slave from a festering wound, a preventable infection, or a manageable disease was, in the eyes of the law, a natural event. The master's decision not to intervene was an exercise of his economic judgment, not a criminal act of negligence. Exposure to the elements was another legally permissible method of disposal. A master could order a slave out of the household and refuse him shelter. In the cold of winter, this was a virtual death sentence. This practice was particularly associated with the treatment of slaves who had become too old or sick to work. The biographer Suetonius notes that the Emperor Claudius had to issue an edict against the practice of abandoning 6 slaves at the temple of Aesculapius on the Tiber Island. Masters would take their infirm slaves to the island, a place associated with healing, and simply leave them there to either recover on their own or die. Claudius's decree stipulated that any slaves so abandoned who recovered would be granted their freedom. Significantly, the edict did not punish the master for the act of abandonment itself. It merely created a disincentive by threatening a loss of property if the slave survived. This reveals the state's reluctance to directly penalize a master for neglecting his human chattel. This principle of death by neglect was not merely a loophole in the law, it was a direct consequence of the slave's legal status as res. An owner has the right to maintain or not maintain his property as he sees fit. If a farmer chooses not to repair a fence and it eventually rots and falls apart, he has not committed a crime. If a master chose not to feed or shelter his human property, that is human property and it subsequently perished, the legal logic was identical. The lex patronia was completely irrelevant to this reality. Its focus was on a specific, public, and spectacular act of commission. The quiet, private, and mundane process of letting a slave die was of no interest to the Roman state. It was a matter of household economics, not public justice. It was a form of killing that was silent, invisible to the legal system, and a perfectly rational, if cruel, expression of a master's absolute power over his disposable assets. Beyond the private acts of commission and omission, the Roman system of slavery possessed a third, more insidious method of destroying human life. the institutionalized use of labor as a terminal sentence. For certain classes of slaves, their assigned work was not intended to be a lifelong occupation but a process of attrition, a means of extracting the maximum possible physical output before the body inevitably failed. This was not neglect in the passive sense, but a highly structured and economically rational system of working human property to death. The state itself sanctioned this practice through its sentencing, and masters utilized it as a convenient, legal, and oft unprofitable method of disposal. The most infamous of these environments were the mines, the metal law. Condemnation to the mines, damnatio in metallum, was a formal legal penalty in the Roman world, considered by many to be a fate worse than a swift execution. The conditions in these state or privately miners-owned operations, particularly the silver mines of Dacia, were notoriously lethal. Slaves were forced to work underground for punishingly long shifts in complete darkness, save for the dim light of oil lamps. The air was thick with dust and fumes, leading to chronic respiratory diseases. The tunnels were often narrow and structurally unsound, making collapses a constant and deadly threat. The labor itself was relentlessly brutal. Slaves would hack at rock faces with picks and hammers, their bodies contorted in cramped spaces. Children were often used to crawl into the narrowest seams to gather ore. Supervision was maintained by armed guards and overseers, who used the whip to enforce a ceaseless pace. The historical account of Diodorus Siculus, describing the conditions in the Ptolemaic gold mines of Egypt, provides a vivid parallel to the Roman reality. Workers, bound in fetters, labored day and night under the lash with no respite for the sick, the old, or the weak. Death was the only escape, and it was a welcome one. For a master, selling a slave to a mine was a simple commercial transaction. For the slave, it was the beginning of a short and agonizing journey to the grave. A similar logic governed the quarries the Lapidii in AE, which supplied the stone for Rome's monumental construction projects. While not subject to the subterranean horrors of the mines, quarry work involved its own set of lethal dangers. Slaves labored under the open sky, exposed to the blistering summer sun and the freezing winter cold. They were tasked with cutting and moving massive blocks of stone, an activity fraught with the risk of crushing injuries from falling rock or equipment failure. The physical toll of such heavy labor, combined with the minimal rations and harsh discipline, ensured a high mortality rate. The very marble that constituted the gleaming temples and forums of Rome was extracted at the cost of countless enslaved lives, a dark foundation of suffering hidden beneath the empire's architectural glory. On a far vaster scale were the great agricultural estates, the latifundii. Here the process of attrition was less dramatic than in the mines but no less certain. The business model of these massive farms, particularly those focused on cash crops like olives and grapes, was based on maximizing output while minimizing the cost of labor. This translated into a grim reality for the field slaves. They were often organized into chain gangs, the KTVAE, and housed at night in fortified barracks, the Ergastudovae, which were little better than prisons. The work was seasonal but intensely demanding, especially during the harvest. The overseer, the Lysias, often a slave himself who had earned his position through loyalty and ruthlessness, was tasked with extracting a set quota of work. His own position depended on his ability to meet these targets, providing a powerful incentive for cruelty. The combination of gruel overwork, a diet that was often insufficient in calories and nutrients, and the diseases that spread rapidly in the crowded Ergastula resulted in a systematically short life expectancy. An owner of a latifundi might calculate that it was more cost-effective to buy new, healthy slaves and work them to death over a few years than to provide the food and care necessary to sustain a labor force over the long term. For a master, these institutions provided a perfect, legal avenue for disposing of a difficult or unwanted slave. He did not need to dirty his own hands. He did not need to seek a magistrate's approval, as the Lex Petronia required. He could simply sell the slave to a mine operator, a quarry owner, or the master of a notoriously harsh latifundi. It was a clean transaction, a transfer of property. But both buyer and seller understood the unspoken reality. They were raiding in a death sentence. The law was concerned only with the legality of the sale, not with the predictable and fatal consequences of the labor to which the slave was being sold. The lex patronia had successfully cordoned off a single, highly public form of execution, placing it under the state's regulatory control. This, however, left a master's fundamental right to act as the ultimate arbiter of his slave's life largely intact. When a master deemed that a slave's transgression warranted a capital sentence, he was not left without options. He simply had to choose a method that did not involve the specific theatricality of the arena's wild beast. The Roman world offered a variety of established, legal, and brutal methods of private execution, allowing a master to impose a death sentence without recourse to a magistrate, thereby circumventing the new law entirely. The most potent and symbolically charged of these methods was crucifixion. Long before it became associated with a single religious event, crucifixion was Rome's chosen punishment for the lowest and most despised members of society: pirates, bandits, rebellious provincials, and, above all, slaves. It was a punishment designed for maximum public humiliation and prolonged agony. It was explicitly intended to be a slow and terrifying spectacle, a sublicium serval, or slave's punishment. The condemned was typically forced to carry his own crossbeam, the patibulum, to the place of execution outside the city walls. There he would be nailed or tied to the wood and hoisted into place, to be left hanging for hours or even days, eventually succumbing to a combination of asphyxiation, dehydration, and shock. While large minor-scale crucifixionists, like the one following the Spartacus revolt, were state-sponsored acts, the right to crucify was not exclusive to the state. A private master could legally inflict this punishment on his own slave. The act itself, performed on the master's own land or even along a private road, was considered an extreme but legitimate exercise of dominica potestas. It was the ultimate assertion of the master's authority, a visceral warning to every other slave on the estate. The historian Tacitus and other sources make it clear that private crucifixionists were a known, if not everyday, occurrence. The decision rested solely with the master. He was the accuser, the judge, and the executioner. The lex patronia was irrelevant, as this form of spectacular death, despite its public nature, did not involve the specific elements, wild beasts, and the formal amphitheater that the law had claimed for the state. Beyond crucifixion, a master could employ simpler and more direct methods of private execution. A slave could be summarily put to the sword or speared by the master himself or his agents. This might occur in the heat of anger or as a cold, premeditated act of punishment. Such an act, committed against one's own property, was not legally defined as murder. It was a domestic disciplinary action. Other, more tortuous methods were also available. A particularly cruel form of punishment involved pitching, where a slave was covered in flammable resin and set alight to serve as a human torch. While this was more famously used by the state, most notably by Nero against the Christians, the principle of a master's right to dispose of his property as he saw fit meant that such methods were not, in themselves, illegal if used privately. The rationale behind the state's indifference to these private executions was rooted in the legal status of the slave. As the slave was property, his destruction was primarily a financial matter concerning the owner. Furthermore, these acts were seen as vital for maintaining the social order. The state relied on individual masters to police their own vast enslaved population. Granting them the power of capital punishment was seen as a necessary tool for deterring disobedience and preventing the kind of large scale revolts that had threatened the republic. The state's interest was in overall stability, and it effectively outsourced the day enforcement of that stability to thousands of individual slave owners. The master's choice of method was his own. He could choose a quick death or a public one, a simple death or a torturous one. The only method now requiring a bureaucratic step was the one that utilized the state's most prestigious stage and its most exotic props. The lex patronia did not build a wall of protection around the slave, it merely built a fence around the amphitheater. A master who desired to kill his slave was not thwarted by the law, he was simply forced to choose a different venue for the final act. The legal framework of Roman slavery provided masters with another, more subtle method of imposing a death sentence, one that was laundered through the mechanisms of the open market. This was the practice of selling a slave into a profession or an environment where a premature and violent death was a near certainty. This method was particularly insidious because it was perked in the legitimacy of a simple commercial transaction. The master was not directly executing the slave, he was merely transferring ownership. Yet both parties to the sale understood the implicit outcome. It was a form of disposal that was not only legal and final but could also be profitable. The most direct route to a legally sanctioned death was to sell a slave to a loniste, the owner and operator of a gladiatorial school, or ludus. Gladiators were among the most socially complex figures in the Roman world, simultaneously despised as infames, persons of low legal standing, and celebrated as popular heroes. While some gladiators were volunteers or condemned criminals, a significant portion were slaves purchased for the specific purpose of fighting and dying in the arena. A master with a physically strong but rebellious slave could find a ready buyer in an loniste. By selling the slave to the sword at gladium, the master washed his hands of the matter. The slave was now the property of the loniste, who would train him and, in due course, rent him out to an editor to fight in the games. While a highly successful gladiator might survive for some years and even win his freedom, the vast majority did not. The career of a gladiator was, by design, short and brutal. He faced the constant risk of death or grievous injury in every match. Even if he survived the combat itself, his fate often rested with the crowd or the sponsor of the games, who could condemn a defeated but living gladiator to death with a simple gesture. When a master sold a slave to a ludus, he was selling him into a system where his life expectancy was measured in a handful of fights. The sale was a death sentence delivered on the installment plan. Another, less glamorous but equally fatal destination was the beast-hunting schools, or the staffs responsible for the venationness in the arena. Slaves sold into this life became bestiarii, who were distinct from the condemned, no exii thrown to the beasts. Bestiarii were trained to hunt and kill, or simply to manage, the dangerous animals used in the games. This was an exceptionally hazardous profession. They faced lions, bears, and leopards in the arena with minimal protection, tasked with providing a thrilling spectacle for the crowd. A mistake was almost always fatal. Selling a slave to become a bestiarii was, like selling to a loniste, a commercially viable way of ensuring his demise. Beyond the specific context of the arena, a master could achieve the same result by selling a slave to the owner of a mine or a notoriously harsh quarry. As previously discussed, these were environments with exceptionally high mortality rates. The market for strong, disposable bodies for these industries was always active. A master in Rome could sell a slave to a trader who specialized in supplying labor for the Spanish silver mines. The master received his payment, the trader his commission, and the slave was marched off to a destination from which he was statistically very unlikely to return. The transaction was clean and legal. The death, which would occur months later from exhaustion, disease, or an accident hundreds of miles away, was disconnected from the original act of sale. This practice highlights the profoundly cynical nature of the Roman legal system's approach to slavery. The law was meticulously concerned with the proper forms of commerce: the bill of sale, the warranty against defects, the clear transfer of title. It was utterly indifferent to the human consequences of that commerce. The Lex Petronia had placed a single administrative hurdle in the path of a master wishing to see his slave killed by beasts for entertainment. It had placed no restrictions whatsoever on a master selling that same slave to be killed by a gladiator's sword or a lion's claw as a profession. This distinction is crucial. One was a private punishment to co-opting a public stage, the other was a legitimate business transaction. By framing the disposal of a human life as a sale, the master absolved himself of direct responsibility and placed the slave's predictable death into the acceptable risk category of a hazardous occupation, a category for which the law had no scrutiny to offer. The various methods of disposal available to a master, whether direct, passive, or commercial, were all underpinned by a single, unassailable legal principle: the complete and total silencing of the slave within the Roman judicial system. The slave was not just physically powerless, he was legally mute. His institutionalized voicelessness was the true foundation of the master's impunity. It ensured that no matter what brutalities occurred within the private sphere of the domus, the primary witness was barred from ever presenting their testimony in a court of law. This legal reality rendered any concept of justice for the enslaved a structural impossibility. The fundamental rule was simple. A slave could not initiate a legal action against their own master. They possessed no legal standing, or locus standi, to appear in court as a plaintiff. This was a direct and logical consequence of their status as race. An object of property cannot sue its owner. To grant a slave this right would have been to concede their personhood, a step that would have unraveled the entire legal and economic fabric of Roman society. For instance, if a master sued a third party for damaging his slave but never the agent, the slave's experience of harm was legally irrelevant. The only recognized damage was the financial loss to the owner's asset portfolio. This legal invisibility was most starkly demonstrated in the rules of evidence. In the rare event that a master was accused of a crime by another citizen, and his slaves were believed to have knowledge of the event, their testimony was subject to a terrifying condition. According to Roman legal theory, a slave's primary loyalty was to their master. It was assumed that, out of either fear or affection, fides, a slave would lie to protect their owner. A slave's testimony in a case involving their master was considered legally inadmissible unless it was extracted under judicial torture, a process known as quaest io per tormenta. The Roman rationale for this practice was cold and utilitarian. It was believed that the application of extreme physical pain was the only mechanism powerful enough to override a slave's loyalty and compel them to speak the truth. But as an instrument of interrogation, a tool for revealing evidence that was otherwise unobtainable. The methods were brutal and varied, including the rack, the application of hot plates, and flogging. A slave's statement, given freely, was worthless. The same statement screamed out in the midst of agony was entered into the legal record as valid testimony. This created a horrific paradox. For a slave's voice to be heard by the law, their body had to be broken by it. This procedural reality casts a new, unrevealing light on the lex patronia itself. The law required a master to present a causa, a reason, to a magistrate before condemning his slave to the beasts. The master would make his accusation that the slave was rebellious, violent, or had attempted to escape. The slave, the accused, stood by as a mute object. He could not offer a defense. He could not refute the master's claims. He could not provide context or mitigating circumstances. The magistrate was tasked with evaluating a case where he could only ever hear one side of the story, presented by a powerful member of his own social class against a legally silenced piece of property. The cause that the master presented existed in a vacuum of contradictory evidence. It was his war against a mandated silence, making the magistrate's approval in many cases a near-minus inevitable procedural step. The inability to testify was therefore the ultimate lock on the cage of slavery. It ensured that the master's power was not just physical but also narrative. He was the sole author of the official story. He could define reality for his slaves, and the law would back his version. A slave who was beaten, starved, or sexually exploited had no legal recourse, no one to whom they could appeal, because the system was designed from the ground up to not hear them. This legal silence was more profound than any physical shackle, ensuring that the vast universe of suffering that constituted the daily reality of slavery remained a private, domestic matter, far beyond the reach of any law, including the narrow and specific regulations of the lex patronia. While the slave remained a legally mute object, the intellectual and political climate of the Roman Empire did not remain static. By the 2nd century AD, during the period of the so-minus called Five Good Emperors, a new series of imperial edicts emerged that, on the surface, appeared to offer greater protection to the enslaved. Emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius issued rulings that directly addressed the master's power over the life and body of his slave. A careful analysis of these reforms reveals that they were less a dawn of humanitarianism and more a continuation and expansion of the political logic initiated by the lex patronia. They were not primarily about protecting the slave, but about consolidating the power of the state and subordinating the private authority of the master to the supreme authority of the emperor. The Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138 AD, took the principle of the lex patronia and broadened its application significantly. Where the earlier law had prohibited a master from throwing a slave to the beasts without a magistrate's consent, Hadrian's legislation, as reported by the jurist Ulpian, forbade a master from killing his slave under any circumstances without judicial approval. The law stated that a master who killed his own slave without bringing him before a magistrate was to be held liable under the Lex Cornelia Dissects, i.e., the standard Roman law on homicide. This was a radical and profound legal shift. It was a direct and unambiguous assault on the ancient, traditional right of the master over the life and death of his slave, the ius vitanecis q. This was not an act of compassion so much as an act of sovereignty. The edict effectively nationalized the act of homicide. It declared that the taking of a human life, regardless of the victim's legal status, was no longer a private matter of domestic discipline, but a public crime that fell under the exclusive jurisdiction of the state. The private power of the master was forced to yield to the public power of the law, was asserting that his authority extended even into the Roman domus, a space traditionally inviolable. The goal was to eliminate private capital punishment and create a state monopoly on the legitimate use of lethal force. A master could still seek the death of his slave, but he had to do so through the state's official channels, thereby acknowledging the state's and by extension, the emperor's supreme authority. Hadrian also issued edicts that regulated other aspects of a master's power. He forbade the sale of male or female slaves to a brothel owner, lino, or a gladiatorial trainer, nomus te, without providing a cause, sine causa. This again echoes the procedural requirement of the Lex Patronia. It did not ban the practice, but it required the master to justify his decision to an official, forcing him to submit his private economic choices to state oversight when they touched upon matters of public morality and spectacle. These laws were instruments of centralization, designed to bring the fragmented, private jurisdictions of the old republican aristocracy under the unified and rationalized control of the imperial bureaucracy. His successor, Antoninus Pius, 138–161 AD, introduced another celebrated piece of legislation. He ruled that a master who treated his slaves with intolerable cruelty, intolerable is SAEVTA, could be compelled to sell them. The mechanism for this was the slave's flight to a sacred place, most notably a temple or a statue of the emperor, an act known as ad statuam confugere. If a provincial governor or magistrate investigated and found the slave's complaint of extreme cruelty to be valid, he could force the master to sell the slave to a new owner who would, presumably, be less brutal. On the surface, this law seems to recognize the slave's suffering, but its legal mechanics tell a different story. Firstly, the remedy was not freedom. The slave remained a slave, a piece of property. The state was merely ordering the transfer of a poorly managed asset from one owner to another. Secondly, the threshold for intervention was not cruelty, but intolerable cruelty, a high and subjective standard. The state was not concerned with routine beatings, only with a level of abuse so extreme that it became a public issue, for example, by causing a slave to flee and disrupt public order by seeking sanctuary. Finally, the act of appealing to the emperor's statue was a powerful piece of political theater. It was not an assertion of the slave's legal rights, but an act of supplication to the emperor's quasi-minus divine person. It reinforced the image of the emperor as a benevolent protector, a source of mercy who stood above the petty tyrannies of individual masters. The law enhanced the emperor's prestige far more than it enhanced the slave's security. It was a law about good governance and public order, intervening only when a master's behavior became so pathological that it threatened the stability and efficiency of the system itself. These imperial reforms, therefore, did not see the slave as a person to be protected, but as an asset whose disposal and treatment were too important to be left entirely to the discretion of private individuals. The Roman legal and social structures that enabled the systemic brute in a philosophical vacuum. They were but wrested and in many cases actively justified by the dominant intellectual traditions of the time. While one might expect philosophy to offer a radical critique of such a morally fraught institution, the major schools of Roman thought, particularly Stoicism, largely served to rationalize, accommodate, or simply ignore the reality of chattel slavery. These philosophies provided the slave minus owning elite with a sophisticated intellectual framework that allowed them to reconcile their personal ethics with their role as masters of human property. The most influential philosophy among the Roman aristocracy was Stoicism, with its emphasis on reason, virtue, and acceptance of one's place in a divinely ordered cosmos. At its core, Stoicism preached the universal brotherhood of man, recognizing that a divine spark or logos resided in every human being. This led to seemingly progressive statements. Seneca the Younger, a prominent Stoic philosopher and one of the wealthiest men in Rome, wrote extensively on the proper treatment of slaves. In his moral epistles, he famously advised his correspondent Lucius to treat his slaves kindly, to dine with them, and to remember that they are fellow slaves, as all humanity is enslaved to fortune. He argued that virtue could be found in a slave just as it could in a nobleman. However, this philosophical position had a profound and convenient limitation. For the Stoics, the crucial distinction was not between slave and free, but between the inner self and external circumstances. True freedom was an internal state of mind, freedom from passion, fear, and desire. True slavery was being captive to one's own vices. A slave could be spiritually freer than his master if he bore his condition with fortitude and reason. A master, conversely, could be a true slave to his anger, lust, and greed. This intellectual framework was, in practice, a powerful tool for justifying the status quo. It allowed a philosopher like Seneca to own vast numbers of slaves and profit from their labor while simultaneously writing about their shared humanity. The Stoic argument did not lead to a call for abolition. Instead, it led to a call for masters to be more humane and for slaves to be more humane and for slaves to be more accepting of their fate. The focus was on reforming the character of the master, not the structure of the institution. Stoicism taught a master to avoid excessive cruelty not because the slave had a right to be free from it, but because such cruelty was a sign of a disordered, passionate soul unbecoming of a wise man. It was a philosophy of paternalistic management, not a doctrine of human rights. Aristotle, whose philosophical influence on Rome was immense, had provided an even more direct and chilling justification for slavery centuries earlier. In his Politics, Aristotle advanced the theory of the natural slave. He argued that some people are, by nature, destined for rule, while others are destined for subordination. He posited that individuals who lacked the full capacity for rational thought and foresight were tools by nature, living instruments best suited to serve those who possessed these higher faculties. For Aristotle, slavery was not just a social convention but a reflection of a natural hierarchy. A person who was a natural slave, he argued, actually benefited from being owned by a master, as it allowed them to be guided by a reason they themselves lacked. While many Roman thinkers did not explicitly adopt the natural slave theory, its intellectual legacy permeated the culture, providing a deep-seated assumption that the existing social order, with its vast gulf between master and slave, was in some way natural and correct. The other major schools of thought offered little in the way of a challenge. Epicureanism, with its focus on the pursuit of pleasure and freedom from disturbance, ataraxia, generally advocated for a withdrawal from the complexities of public life. While Epicurean communities might include slaves as members, the philosophy did not mount a systemic critique of the institution itself. For the most part, Roman philosophy turned its gaze inward. It provided the educated elite with a set of tools for personal and moral self-improvement within the existing social structure, not for the radical reimaging of that structure. The slave, suffering from this elevated philosophical perspective, was merely one example of the misfortunes to which all humans were subject. The prescribed response was not political action, but the cultivation of inner resilience. This left the physical reality of chains, whips, and legal existence entirely untouched, shrouded in a respectable cloak of high-minded indifference. The official record of Roman slavery, the laws, the philosophical treatises, the agricultural manuals, is a monologue delivered by the master class. It is a vast and detailed archive of ownership, management, and control. From these sources, we can reconstruct the mechanics of the institution with forensic precision. What is almost entirely absent, however, is the voice of the enslaved themselves, the legal and social system that rendered them historically silent. To access even a fragmented sense of their experience, One must become an archaeologist of whispers, piecing together the limited and often indirect traces they left behind. The most direct, though still mediated, evidence comes from funerary inscriptions or epitaphs. While slaves could not legally own property, a master might permit them to accumulate a small personal fund, or PCUU. With this, or with the master's patronage, a slave might be able to afford a modest burial marker. These inscriptions, carved in stone, offer fleeting glimpses into the emotional lives and social bonds that the law refused to recognize. We find memorials erected by one slave for their concubinal heirs, their partner in a union that had no legal standing but was clearly a deeply felt marriage in their own eyes. We find epitaphs for children, the Verna E., born into slavery, mourned by their enslaved parents who had no legal claim to them. These inscriptions often reveal a profound adoption of Roman social norms and values, a desire to be seen as respectable members of the household, the familia. A slave might be commemorated for his loyalty, fides, or his diligent service. A beloved slave nurse might be honored by her former charges, now grown and free. However, these are, by their nature, the stories of the more fortunate, typically urban, domestic slaves who enjoyed a closer relationship with their owners and had the means to be memorialized. They represent the upper echelon of the enslaved population. The voices of the millions who toiled and died anonymously in the mines and on the latifundiae are almost entirely lost, their existence recorded only in the aggregate calculations of agricultural writers like Cato and Varro. A second source of fragmented testimony comes from the surviving literature of the period, but it requires careful interpretation. The comedies of Plautus and Terence feature numerous stock characters who are slaves. These characters are often depicted as cunning, resourceful, and far more intelligent than their masters, driving the plot forward with their schemes. While these are highly stylized and comedic portrayals, they may reflect a certain reality of the Roman household, where masters were indeed heavily reliant on the skills and knowledge of their enslaved staff. The clever slave trope, while played for laughs, hints at a world of constant negotiation, low-level resistance, and the assertion of personal agency within the narrow confines of servitude. More poignant are the scattered references found in the works of former slaves who achieved freedom and literacy. The philosopher Epictetus, a prominent Stoic, had been a slave in the household of one of Nero's courtiers. His teachings, recorded by his student Arrian, are suffused with a focus on inner freedom and resilience in the face of external powerlessness, while he rarely speaks directly of his own experiences. His philosophical emphasis on distinguishing what is within one's control from what does not resonates with the lived reality of someone whose body was once the property of another. His philosophy can be read as a profound and sophisticated intellectual response to the trauma of enslavement. Finally, we have the scant physical and archaeological evidence of resistance. Curses inscribed on lead tablets, dissects, found buried near homes or graves, sometimes call down punishments upon masters or fellow slaves. While the authorship is often uncertain, they speak to a world of hidden resentments and conflicts playing out in the shadows of the official social order. The very existence of the instruments of control, the shackles, the collars, the brands, is itself a form of silent testimony. These objects would not have been necessary if the enslaved population were entirely docile and content. They are artifacts of a power dynamic that was always contested, always maintained through the application or threat of force. These fragments, an epitaph for a loved one, a clever line in a play, a philosophical reflection on freedom, a buried curse, do not constitute a coherent narrative. They are isolated points of light in an overwhelming darkness. They do not allow us to fully reconstruct the subjective experience of the Roman slave, but they are invaluable because they are cracks in the monolithic facade of dominica potestas. They remind us that the res, the thing of Roman law, was always a persona, a human being, who loved, grieved, resisted, and sought dignity in a system designed to deny it. The Roman system of chattel slavery, with its intricate legal framework and its sanctioned instruments of brutality, was not a social pathology or a moral failing from the perspective of the Roman state. It was a fundamental and necessary component of its imperial architecture. The exploitation of enslaved labor was the economic engine that powered the legions, built the cities, and sustained the luxurious lifestyle of the elite. The entire edifice of Roman civilization, from its military expansion to its monumental art, rested upon this dark and indispensable foundation. To understand Roman slavery is to understand the material basis of Roman power. The period of Rome's most dramatic territorial expansion during the late Republic was directly fueled by, and in turn fueled, the slave trade. Military campaigns were not just about strategic objectives. Their wealth generated from the sale of hundreds of thousands of captives funded further wars, paid the legions, and enriched the generals, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of conquest and enslavement. Cheap labor force fundamentally reshaped the Italian economy. Small, independent farms, the traditional backbone of the early republic, could not compete with the enormous slave-powered estates, the latifundiae, owned by the wealthy aristocracy. This led to a mass displacement of the rural free population, who flocked to Rome, creating the volatile urban proletariat that the policy of bread and circuses was designed to placate. Once the empire's borders stabilized under the Pax Romana, and the supply of new captives from warfare dwindled, the economic reliance on slavery did not diminish. It simply shifted to a more sustainable, internally generated model based on the breeding of slaves, the verni. The institution became more deeply embedded in every facet of the economy. In agriculture, slave labor produced the grain, wine, and olive oil that were the staples of the Mediterranean world. This agricultural surplus was the key to supporting the large standing army and the massive urban population of Rome itself. Without the latifundiae, the empire could not have fed its soldiers or its citizens. In the urban centers, enslaved labor was equally critical. Slaves were the primary workforce in construction, quarrying the stone and firing the bricks for the aqueducts, temples, and amphitheaters that still stand as testaments to Roman engineering. They worked in manufacturing workshops, producing pottery, textiles, and metal goods. They staffed the service industries, working in bathhouses, taverns, and bakeries. The state itself was a massive slave owner, using public slaves, the Serbi public eye, for municipal tasks like road maintenance and clerical work in government offices. The smooth functioning of the imperial bureaucracy was dependent on the literate skills of enslaved scribes and accountants. The wealth of the Roman elite was not just displayed by their slave holdings. It was the senator's income derived from his agricultural estates, from the workshops he owned, and from the interest on loans he made. All businesses operated by enslaved managers and laborers. The domestic household, the domus, was a microcosm of this economic reality. A large staff of specialized slaves was not merely a luxury. They were the infrastructure that enabled the master to engage in politics, business, and leisure. The slave who tutored his children, the slave who managed his finances, and the slave who cooked his meals all freed the master's time and energy for the pursuits considered worthy of a Roman nobleman. This total economic dependency created an ideological imperative to see slavery as a natural and necessary part of the social order. Any serious challenge to the institution would have been a challenge to the very foundation of their world. It would have been economically ruinous and socially unthinkable. The laws that defined the slave as property, the philosophies that rationed and enforced his obedience were not accidental cruelties. They were the essential software and hardware required. The Lex Patroni and later reforms were merely minor patches to this operating system, designed to fix specific bugs that threatened public stability, but never intended to question the fundamental code. The suffering of the individual slave was the price of empire, a cost that was calculated, accepted, and deemed necessary. This absolute economic reliance upon an enslaved class created a profound and inescapable psychological paradox for the Roman elite. While they were the masters, the holders of absolute power, they were also a numerical minority living in a state of perpetual, low-grade siege. They were utterly dependent on a vast population whom they systematically oppressed, and this dependency fostered a deep and abiding fear. The anatomy of Roman cruelty cannot be fully understood without dissecting this anatomy of elite fear. It was this pervasive dread, the constant awareness of the enemy within, that rationalized the system's most brutal aspects and shaped its legal mechanisms of control. The fear was, in the first instance, a matter of simple arithmetic. In the great urban households and on the sprawling rural estates, the free members of a family were often vastly outnumbered by their slaves. A single wealthy family might own hundreds, even thousands of slaves. This demographic imbalance was a constant, silent threat. The master dining in his triclinium, being served by a dozen slaves, was acutely aware that he was in a room with a dozen potential assassins. The mistress of the house, attended by her handmaidens, was in the hands of women who might harbor deep resentments. This reality was captured in the common proverb, quoted by Seneca, that we have as many enemies as we have slaves. This was not hyperbole, it was a sober assessment of their existential vulnerability. This fear was not just of a large minor-scale rebellion in the mold of Spartacus, though that memory served as a powerful historical cautionary tale. The more immediate and insidious fear was of individual acts of violence within the intimate confines of the domus. The slave who prepared the master's food had the power to poison it. The slave who acted as the master's barber held a razor to his throat every morning. The slave who nursed the master's children had unsupervised access to the heirs of the family. Roman literature is filled with stories, both real and cautionary, of masters murdered in their beds or poisoned at their own tables. This intimate proximity to a potentially hostile population created a unique and corrosive form of paranoia. Every slave was a potential threat, and their obedience could never be fully trusted because it was compelled by force, not by loyalty. To manage this constant psychological pressure, the Roman elite developed a powerful ideology of dehumanization. It was a necessary mental defense. Slaves were characterized in literature and private letters as being inherently lazy, deceitful, cowardly, and prone to vice. They were seen as constitutionally incapable of the virtues that defined a Roman citizen, such as honor, duty, and self-control. This process of ideological othering was a psychological palliative. It transformed a fellow human being into a lesser category of being, one that required constant surveillance and harsh discipline for its own good and for the safety of society. The speech of Gaius Cassius Longinus during the debate over the fate of Paedonia II dissects slaves as the ultimate articulation of this mindset. The slave population was a foreign nation, an internal threat that could only be managed by terror. This fear was directly codified in Roman law. The horrific principle of collective punishment that all slaves under a roof would be executed if one of them murdered the master was the ultimate legal expression of this paranoia. It was a law designed to make every slave the unwilling guarantor of the master's life. That a slave's testimony against their master could only be accepted under torture was another manifestation of this deep seated distrust. The law simply assumed that a slave's natural state was one of deceptive loyalty that could only be broken by overwhelming physical pain. Therefore, the relentless brutality of the system was not, from the Roman perspective, an expression of arbitrary sadism, though individual masters were certainly sadistic. It was a rational, if terrifying, security policy. The floggings, the brandings, the shackles, and the constant threat of a painful death were seen as necessary deterrents, a security cordon of pain built around the slave-owning class. The master was, in a very real sense, a captive of the system that gave him his power. He lived in a gilded cage, forever watching the human property that sustained him, perpetually suspicious, and convinced that only a regime of absolute and unflinching terror stood between his family and their violent annihilation. The system of control and exploitation built upon the foundation of elite fear was, for a time, brutally effective. However, its very rigidity contained the seeds of its own transformation. An institution maintained by constant external pressure and internal terror is inherently brittle. When the immense geopolitical and economic forces that shaped the early empire began to shift, the classical model of chattel slavery, particularly in the agricultural sector, began a slow and inexorable process of institutional decay. This was not a moral awakening or a revolution from below, but a long, pragmatic adaptation to a changing world, resulting in the gradual blurring of the stark line between slave and free. The primary catalyst for this change was the end of imperial expansion. The Pax Romana, established in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, brought relative peace and stability to the empire's borders. The legions transitioned from armies of conquest to forces of frontier defense. This had a profound and unforeseen economic consequence. It choked off the massive, continuous supply of cheap human captives that had the slave markets during the late Republic and early Empire. But its demographic and economic basis was fundamentally altered. With fewer prisoners of war available, the price of slaves rose significantly. The old business model of the latifundie, which treated slaves as disposable commodities to be worked to death and cheaply replaced, became economically unsustainable. This new reality forced large landowners to adopt a different calculus. Their existing slave population was now a much more valuable and expensive asset. The focus shifted from short-term exploitation and self-sufficiency. Breeding, which had always been a source of slaves, now became the primary one. This incentivized masters to maintain their slave populations in a condition that was at least conducive to reproduction and survival, encouraging stable family units, providing slightly better rations, and reducing the most extreme forms of lethal overwork were no longer acts of benevolence, but of sound economic management. A slave owner was now less of a consumer of human lives and more of a rancher, carefully managing his human stock to ensure a sustainable supply of labor. This change in economic strategy led to a profound change in the organization of agricultural labor. The chain-gang system of the Agastulum, while effective for brutal enforcement, was inefficient and offered no incentive for productivity. Landowners began to discover that it was more profitable to settle their slaves on individual plots of land as tenant farmers. These slaves, known as servikosserai, hut slaves, were allotted a small parcel to work for themselves and their families. They owed their master a portion of their crop and, critically, a specified number of days of labor, on the master's main domain, the portion of the estate he farmed directly. This arrangement provided the slave with a measure of autonomy, a direct stake in his own productivity, and a more stable family life. His condition was still one of servitude, but it was a world away from the constant terror and physical confinement of the chain gang. Simultaneously, the status of the free roll pool was declining. Economic pressures and debt forced many small, independent farmers to sell their land and become tenant farmers or coloni on the great estates. Initially, these were free contractual arrangements. However, the crises of the 3rd century and the subsequent reforms of emperors like Diocletian and Constantine in the early 4th century dramatically altered their status. To stabilize the empire's tax base and halt the flight of agricultural labor, these emperors issued edicts that legally bound the coloni and their descendants to the land they worked. A colonus was still technically a free man he could legally marry, and he was not his landlord's property. But his freedom of movement was eliminated. He was tied to the soil, an appendage of the estate. The result of these two parallel developments was a historic convergence. The legal status of the rural slave was slowly rising, gaining a semblance of autonomy and family life as a servus carcerarius. The legal status of the free peasant was sinking, losing his mobility and becoming a hereditary fixture of the land as a colonus. The clear, bright line of the law that had once rigidly separated the enslaved race from the free persona became blurred and indistinct in the countryside. They began to merge into a new, vast class of free agricultural laborers whose lives were defined not by ownership of their bodies, but by their hereditary obligation to a piece of land. This was the genesis of medieval serfdom. It was a transformation driven not by a dawning sense of humanity, but by the cold, impersonal logic of economic necessity and imperial official policy. The slow transformation of the Roman slave into the medieval serf marked the end of an era, but it did not mark the end of the legal ideas that had defined classical slavery. The formal collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century led to a fragmentation of its unified legal system, with Roman jurisprudence being largely supplanted by the customary laws of the various Germanic kingdoms. For several centuries, the sophisticated and brutal logic of Roman property law lay dormant, preserved in manuscripts studied by a handful of clerics. Yet, this legal code was not dead, it was merely sleeping. Its rediscovery and reapplication centuries later would prove that its most potent dangerous concepts had lost none of their power. The critical moment of revival occurred in the High Middle Ages, beginning in the late 11th century. Scholars, particularly at the nascent University of Bologna, began to systematically study the corpus juris civilis, a massive 6th-century compilation of Roman law ordered by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. This body of work, especially its section known as the Digest, represented the pinnacle of Roman legal thought, a system of breathtaking complexity, internal logic, and intellectual rigor. As European society grew more complex, its own customary laws often proved inadequate for regulating commerce, property, and governance. Roman law, in contrast, offered a ready-made, highly sophisticated framework. Its studies spread rapidly across Europe, and its principles began to be integrated into the legal systems of the emerging nation-states and the canon law of the Church. It was during the Age of Exploration, beginning in the 15th century, that the darkest aspects of this rediscovered legal heritage were repurposed with devastating effect. As European powers, led by Portugal and Spain, began their colonial expansion and initiated the transatlantic slave trade, they required a legal framework to justify the mass enslavement of non-minus European peoples. They found it waiting for them in the pages of Roman law. The legal definition of a human being as res, a movable, alienable object of property, provided the perfect doctrinal foundation for the new, large-scale commercial slavery. It offered a pre-existing, intellectually respectable system for stripping millions of Africans of their personhood and reducing them to the status of commodities to be bought, sold, and insured like any other cargo. One of the most pernicious Roman legal principles to be adopted was partus sequitur ventrem, the offspring follows the womb. This doctrine, which stated that a child's legal status was determined by that of its mother, was a cornerstone of Roman slavery, ensuring a self-perpetuating supply of verna e. Colonial legislatures, particularly in the English colonies of North America, explicitly codified this Roman principle into their own slave laws. A Virginia law of 1662, for example, decreed that children would be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. This was a brutally efficient legal tool. It not only guaranteed that the children of enslaved women would remain property in perpetuity, but it also legally incentivized the sexual exploitation of female slaves by their owners, as any children resulting from such unions would add to the master stock of human assets. The entire legal architecture of colonial slavery mirrored its Roman predecessor. Colonial slave codes systematically denied the enslaved legal personhood. Slaves could not own property, enter into contracts, or legally marry. Their testimony against a white person was inadmissible in court, creating the same legally mandated silence that had protected the Roman master. The master's power of discipline, including the use of extreme violence, was legally protected as a necessary aspect of managing his property. The Roman legal framework, born in a pre-racial, multi-ethnic empire, was now fused with the new ideologies of race to create a system of hereditary chattel slavery more rigid and inescapable than even the Romans had devised. The sophisticated jurisprudence intended to regulate the transfer of Italian farmland and livestock was redeployed with terrifying precision to manage the buying, selling, and breeding of human beings on the plantations of the Americas. The echoes of the Roman law schools could be heard in the crack of the overseers whip 1,000 years later and an ocean away. The legal principles of Roman property law, so elegantly and logically constructed, did not vanish with the empire that created them. Instead, they proved to be a durable and adaptable intellectual technology, capable of being repurposed for new and terrible ends. Our examination of this system has centered on a single, specific statute passed in the year 61 AD, the Lex Petronia, serves as the perfect lens through which the entire institution of Roman slavery can be brought into sharp focus. It stands as a stark and revealing monument to the Roman capacity for creating the illusion of justice, while meticulously preserving the architecture of terror. On its face, the law was a reform. It intervened in the sphere of the master's absolute power, the dominica potestas, and declared one specific act, the feeding of a slave to all beasts for public entertainment, to be no longer a matter of private discretion. It required the master to submit his will to the authority of the state, to present a cause before a magistrate. This procedural hurdle created a veneer of legal oversight, a suggestion that the state now stood as a protector, however remote, against the most capricious forms of cruelty. It was a law that one could point to as evidence of Roman civilization's advance, of its willingness to place limits on even its most powerful citizens. But this was a calculated illusion. The true measure of the lex patronia is not in what it prohibited, but in the vast universe of brutality it left untouched. For every one method of killing that the law regulated, 1,000 others remained the master's legal and unquestioned prerogative. The law was silent on the master's right to beat a slave to death with a flagrum in the privacy of his own courtyard. It was silent on his right to crucify a disobedience, slave along a private road, a slow and agonizing spectacle of domestic authority. It offered no opinion on the slow, passive execution of a slave through starvation, exposure, or the deliberate withholding of medical care. The law concerned itself with the dramatic aesthetics of the amphitheater, but it had nothing to say about the quiet, mundane lethality of the master's daily power. The lex patronia did not prevent a master from effectively signing a slave's death warrant through a simple commercial transaction. The sale of a human being to a gladiatorial school, to the beast miners' hunts, to the quarries, or to the mines with their notoriously short life expectancies continued, unabated and unregulated. These were not considered punishments requiring a magistrate's review. They were legitimate transfers of property, and the predictable, fatal outcome was merely a consequence of the asset's new use. The law was equally unprofoundly silent on the master's absolute sexual access to the bodies of his slaves, a form of violation so deeply embedded in the concept of ownership that it was not even recognized as a harm in need of regulation. Ultimately, the lex patronia was not a humanitarian statute but a political one. It was an act of state consolidation. It did not challenge the master's right to kill, but rather the master's right to kill in a manner that condemnation to the beasts was a ritual of sovereignty, and the law simply asserted the state's monopoly over that ritual. By forcing the master's private will to be laundered through a public magistrate, the state transformed a personal act of Roman justice, reinforcing its own authority while managing the public order that the Pede Onius Secundus affair had threatened. The law therefore did not protect the slave. It protected the integrity of the state's spectacle and the stability of the city. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering, a single, highly visible gear in the machine of social control that did nothing to slow the grinding down of human lives, but only served to make the sound of it more orderly, more official, and more aligned with the interests of imperial power. The chronicle of this single law, the lex patronia, is thus complete. It serves as a case study, a detailed dissection of a legal principle that offered a whisper of protection while shouting its affirmation of the system it pretended to reform. But to leave our examination here, with the cold facts of legal history, is to miss the more profound and disquieting truth that the story reveals. The true subject is not the law itself, but the human capacity to construct elaborate, rational, and intellectually sophisticated systems to justify unregulated acts of profound cruelty. This history forces us to confront the nature of law itself. We wish to see it as a shield, a protector of the weak and a restraint on the powerful. But as the Roman case demonstrates, law can also be a weapon. It can be a tool for defining a human being as a thing, for codifying the mechanisms of their oppression, and for providing a veneer of due process to acts of terror. It can create categories of personhood and non-personhood so rigid that they become unquestioned realities, allowing a society to function with perfect efficiency and brutal inhumanity. The Romans were not primitive savages, they were among the most advanced legal and administrative minds in history. Their system of slavery was not a chaotic frenzy of violence, but a highly organized and legally sanctioned institution. This reveals a deeper, more timeless pattern. Societies often choose to regulate the most visible and theatrical symptoms of an injustice rather than confronting the disease itself. The lex patronia addressed the spectacle of the arena, a public and undeniable horror, because its disorder threatened to spill into the streets. It did not address the silent, daily suffering in the fields, the mines, and the households, because that suffering was the productive and accepted engine of their world. We are left with the question of what our own society chooses to see and what it chooses to ignore, which cruelties we find aesthetically offensive, and which we accept as the necessary, unexamined cost of our own comfort and order. The story of this one Roman law is not just about the past, it is a mirror. This story is over. But the weaknesses it exposed, fear, greed, hatred, are not historical artifacts. They are part of us. A final thought before you sleep.